Hi class, welcome to week 7. Can't believe we're already almost halfway through the semester. But this week we're really going to start designing. We're going to get into Photoshop and start figuring out what these websites are going to look like, which is really going to be a whole lot of fun. In today's lesson I just wanted to talk about a couple things that I think will really help when we start designing out our web pages. So the first thing I want to look at are two different sites, and we're looking here at the background. And you can remember that the background is one of the architectural elements of the website that we looked at earlier on in one of the readings when we were looking at the anatomy of the website, and background is one of those components. So here's two examples of websites that handle background and content a little differently. So the first one is yaratreviso.com. I think I showed this website earlier in a previous example on one of the threads, but I want you to notice that the background on this website is always 100% of the width of your browser. So even when you're scaling your browser, the background image is scaling with it, and there's no vertical scrolling in this type of website. So no matter what page you're on, the content is always going to scale with your browser, creating an experience that's very much full screen. Now, the other version of something that you can do is playing with that 960 width space. So here we have a website for Babo NYC. This is a Mario Batali restaurant, a website that we made about a year or so ago. And you can see here that the background is a plain white, and we have our content, which is 960. Let's see if I can put this on. So I have a little Safari plugin that adds a 960 grid on top of websites. So you can see here these little columns. So our content is always floating in the center of our web page, and the background is just a solid white. There's a slight color differentiation on the content portion that separates out the content from the background. So I just wanted to keep that in mind when we start designing our web pages. There are really two different ways that we can go about it. We can create something that's more full screen, or we can create a more traditional 960 width website and just have a background element that sits on the back of everything. So yeah. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is actually setting up your website. So here I have my Photoshop file open. This is that 960 grid template that I sent you all to download earlier in the semester. And I think it's 960 JS or something like that. I forget what the web URL is, but you could just Google 960 grid and download the template. And this is the 24 column grid that I opened up. And so how do we even begin? So generally what I like to do is I like to change the size of my canvas, because right now this is a little short and my content is probably going to be a little taller than this. But I can turn my guides on and I can drag a ruler down to around 600, and this is going to be where my above the fold line is. So pretty much any content that is above this guide will appear as soon as you get to the home page before you have to scroll. So generally what I do is I'll resize my canvas and I'll make it a little wider. So let's say I'll make this 1200, and I'll make the height maybe about 1800 if I know that I'm going to have a site that's going to have a lot of content that I'm going to want to scroll. And this way I can, when I make the site a little wider, it allows me to really get a sense of what that background is going to be. So I'm just going to unlock these guides and just make them taller. And now I have a little bit more width so I can play around with my background. So talking about background images, you can see that like on the Yara Treviso site we had an image that scaled with the browser, or we could have a color on the background, or we could even have patterns on the background. So what we can do is I'm just going to create a solid shape That's going to be my content. So I'm going to drag this down, just create a shape layer. So I know that this is where the content of my website is going to sit, and now I want to play a little bit with my background. I'm actually going to make this a little bit wider. So if this was my content, I could have a background color if I wanted my website to maybe have a nice solid color background. Could do something like maybe a pale blue or a gray blue. And all my content would sit in there, and that white box would float in the center. But we could also create patterns or seamless patterns or textures that repeat on the x-axis and the y-axis to create something that's a little bit more textural. So where do we go and find things like that? So if we go to the web, and I just Googled seamless patterns Photoshop, there's going to be a lot of resources that you can download that create seamless patterns for you to use in your web designs. So let's click on one of these links and see if we can find something that we like. Some of these can be a little cheesy, so we want to have something that's, you know, that's suitable to what we're trying to do. So here, let's click on this one. And let's download this zip file. Alright, and let's take a look at that folder. So these are all PNGs, and so what I can do is I can look at these, and I can find which one I want to use. Oh, the polka dot one is kind of cool. So they have polka dots with different widths. We have some stripes. We have some like hand-drawn polka dots, some hand-drawn lines. Let's go with the hand-drawn polka dots. I kind of like those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up in Photoshop, and I'm going to select it all. So I'm going to go to Select All, and then I'm going to go to Edit, Define Pattern. And I'm going to call this polka dots. Great. Now what I can do is I can go back here, and on my background layer, I can add a layer style that is the pattern. So I'm going to click on Pattern Overlay. And now that polka dot pattern that I just defined should show up in my pattern options. So you also have the ability to scale the pattern. So if I wanted these polka dots to be a little smaller or to be a little bigger, I could do that as well. The problem with making them a little larger is it's going to start to pixelate our image. So, and you can also change the opacity of the pattern, which will pull in the color underneath. Other things that we can do is I can create a solid layer. Let's say I wanted something like this, and I could put this over my background layer and change the blending mode, so that way I could change the color of my to get a different color palette for these polka dots. So there are lots of resources online for seamless patterns, so I encourage you to take a look around and download some that you like and try them out. Or we could use solid color, or we could use a gradient that goes vertically or horizontally. I would stay away from radial gradients because those are going to be more complicated to develop. Patterns are really, really easy. Developers really, really like them because they're really simple to implement. So let's find one that we like. Maybe this is nice. We'll bring the opacity down so it's just subtle. Bring this down to 30. Bring this down with it. And then we need a solid white on the background so we can see what everything looks like on white. Great. And now we just have a little texture in the background that is going to just help our designs. So the other thing that we would do here now is we would start with the navigation or the sidebar elements. And one thing that I think is really important is keeping our content organized. So I always use folders. So I would create a folder that's called background, and I would put all of this in my background folder, because when we hand this off to our developers, we want to make sure that our files are really, really organized, because they're going to be the ones that are looking through our Photoshop files and actually developing out the content. Other things that I'll do is I'll create a folder that's maybe called navigation. And so let's say I have my navigation. I'll create some text. Before we actually do text, we're going to talk about text right now. I guess this is a perfect way to go into that. We can't just use any types of fonts that we want with web design. This is because web browsers are only able to render certain fonts, and we want to make sure that all of our text is live. So there's a thing called web-safe fonts that, as web designers, we really need to be aware of what we're using. We can't just use any font that we download on the web, because they're not going to render in browsers. So there are a couple of resources that we can go to find web-safe fonts. And one of them is Google Fonts. So Google Fonts has a huge library of fonts that you can use and download that are really easy to implement into your website, because you're just linking to the Google server, and it's able to pull in those fonts. So Google Fonts is really fantastic. You can browse by category, serif, sans serif, display, and handwriting. You can also choose width and thickness and slant. And a lot of these fonts have multiple styles too. So like Libre Bakersfield has 3 different styles. And if we come down, we can see that it has a normal, a bold, and an italic. And there are some really great fonts that Google has that you could use to download and implement into your designs. The other is a website called Font Squirrel, and this has a lot more, but some of these fonts that are web safe that you could use, you have to buy licenses for. So it becomes a little expensive if you want to use a very specific font, because you're going to need to pay to have the license for it. There are free fonts on Font Squirrel. I encourage you to dig around, but I really want you all to use web-safe fonts in your designs. So that's going to be for your navigation, for any type of headers and any type of body text. You must use web-safe fonts. It's really, really important. So here's one. I think I might have Source Sans installed on my computer. I also know that I have Quicksand. So I'm going to use one of those web-safe fonts to create the nav bar. So I'm just going to click Home. Let's see, let's use Quicksand because I know that I have that. Home. About, let's see, what is this website about? This website is about, it'll be about me. So home, about, contact. We're going to do something really simple. So I think all of these are maybe a little too big. And scale them down just a bit. And here, let's view this at 100%. Let's say I would have my logo up in here. So I want this to be centered. This is just a placeholder for where my logo would go. I probably wouldn't even need home because the logo could always link home. So maybe this is my portfolio. And now I can lay these out so they're evenly spaced on this grid. So I'm going to organize this out. We'll rename this one logo, and I'll update that one later. And then we have our navigation. And things that I like to include in my PSD file for each link is the rollover state. So that way it's really clear what the rollovers are going to look like on my website, because that's a really important part of this. So what I could do is I could either give one example, or for each one I could create subfolders in navigation for each of these. Portfolio, contact, and this one's going to be about. And I could have an on folder and an off folder. On, off. So off would be when it's not rolled over, and I could duplicate about, put it in my on folder, turn this one off, and I can change the color to show my on state. And maybe there is a underline or some type of indication. I know I'm going really simple here, but just wanted to show you how things can get organized. So that way, now I have an on and an off, and I can toggle them. So that way my files are really, really organized, and that's something that's really, really important when we get into really complex files with a lot of different layers and a lot of different elements. So I'm excited to see what you guys come up with for this week. The homework is to create 3 different designs of your homepage. I would love each version of the homepage to have a different color palette and a different font treatment. And I want you to think about navigation fonts, what are the fonts for your headlines or headers, and what is your body copy. And I want you to explore 3 different, totally different variations, and we have our wireframes to give us a sense of where the content is going to go. But this week it's really all about what it looks like. So again, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the assignment, and I look forward to seeing all your work this week. Okay, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.